This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. As usual, Canada was completely unprepared for war in either 1914 or 1939 by land, sea, or air, and expedients had to be resorted to. In tonight's talk, RCN veteran and naval writer Fraser McKee describes one of those expedients, the co-opting of civilian yachts into naval service. Over to you, Pat Hind-White and Fraser.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Patricia Hind-White, organizer of this event. Welcome to RCMI's virtual military history night, Wednesday, February the 2nd, 2022. This presentation will be videotaped for educational purposes and available on RCMI YouTube. Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me, Fraser?
Yes, I hear you.
Oh, good. Guest speaker Fraser McKee and his topic, Canada's use of armed yachts in the two world wars. Fraser McKee, Commander, Naval Reserves, retired, was born in Toronto and joined the RCNVCR in March 1943. He served ashore and at sea out of Halifax, staying in the Naval Reserves until 1978. He has written 6 books on the Navy and Merchant Navy and still writes maritime and naval book reviews for several publications. Canada was basically unprepared for either of the two world wars, and tonight Fraser will talk about the expedients adapted by the Royal Canadian Navy when 21 privately owned CX motor yachts, mostly American, were taken into the Royal Canadian Navy service in 1914-15 and again in 1940 to augment our then, and in each case, a very small navy until more useful warships like trawlers in the First World War and corvettes in the Second could be financed and built. Fraser's presentation will introduce us to most of the original owners, the local people, mostly yachtsmen who went quietly into the States to acquire the vital vessels for both wars, how they were adapted, and the eventual fate of these vessels. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, a warm, very warm welcome, Fraser. I'm virtually speaking. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Pat. And thank the people that have been helping in setting it up. My daughter, Jill, from Whitehorse in the Northwest Territories, and Sylvia Lau and Eric Morse and both Tuja and Margaret from the RCMI setting up the organization. This evening is having a look at our naval history. Some of it in the Second War, even within living memory, for a few of us. In the First and the Second War, we went into these wars, not at our own behest, but because the British Empire did, and we were part of it. And as a start, I'd like to recall that in August 1914, the Navy was less than 4 years old. It was formed in 1910, so that'd be the same as if we were doing something today that was started in 2018. That's not very long ago. And that was a bit of a problem. Up until then, the Royal Navy had looked after all our requirements when required. They had ships in Halifax and Bermuda and on the West Coast. Our Navy in 1914 consisted of 2 ships, period, no other ones. There was the reasonably medium-sized cruiser, Niobe, which is the one on the left, and on the West Coast, the rather older, 24 years old, Rainbow on the West Coast of the Esquimalt, and that was all we had. Now, the problem with that was that they had to have patrols off the coast, and the 2 cruisers weren't exactly the right thing to use them. And there was definitely a threat The threat came on the west coast from Admiral von Spee, who had a force of 4 ships, 2 heavy cruisers. The bottom picture, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and in the upper picture, Leipzig and Emden, cruising in the Pacific. He was going around shelling British-owned islands, and in fact, Leipzig was coaling in California. That's how close it was. And out there in California, we had Rainbow to protect us, a cruiser that was smaller than their larger cruisers. That's not a very good thing for the poor old Navy to get into. On the East Coast, the threat was going to be the Kaiser submarine navy. They had 48 submarines, and unless you're a submarine purist, they look pretty much like the Second War submarines. There's really not a lot of difference between them. Those submarines were quite capable of crossing the ocean, and in fact, a year later, in 1915, they had a shipping submarine, the Deutschland, that came over to pick up badly wanted supplies in the United States. But we had nothing to attack submarines. Now, when I say attacking, there was no ASIC, it hadn't been invented yet. Once the submarine went under the surface, it disappeared. And in fact, a lot of people used to say that submarines are really surface ships that could submerge. They tended to fire their torpedoes when they were at or almost at the surface by they could attack almost at the surface, and that was all. But once they went under the surface, at the start of the war, there weren't even depth charges. That progressed gradually as it went on. Available to the government were about 47 government-owned ships. Some of them would have been quite satisfactory, like the one in the lower right, the HMCS Cartier. There was a survey vessel. On the upper left, there was the Gulnar, which was a service ship. On the upper right was one owned by the post office, oddly enough. She worked out of either Quebec City or Rimouski. The post office had a ship that would meet outbound liners delivering the last mail and meet inbound liners to pick up the mail. On the lower left is a small one called a Constance, and a lot of them were that size. Also, the problem was that a lot of these ships could not be loaned to the Navy because they were needed for their normal jobs. Their normal jobs, the ships were needed for their normal lighthouse protection and buoy placing, or in the winter, during the winters, they were needed for ice breaking. So they couldn't be loaned to the Navy, which the Navy had rather counted on. So the first person that made a practical offer to the Navy, outside the Navy, to help was John Eaton of the Eaton Store, the Eaton Store family. He offered the Navy the use of his yacht, Florence, at no cost. Transfer the cost of $1 to just cover the transfer, and so on. And Admiral Kingsmill, or Rear Admiral Kingsmill as he was then, and was horrified at the idea of using a civil yacht as a naval vessel. And they said, no, thank you very much. And John Eaton said, all right. And he laid her up for the winter of 1914-15 and laid off most of his crew, except a few of the engineers, to keep her in shape, and went about his work, which was then to finance the cost of a machine gun battalion for the Army.
Get her.
In the spring of 1915, Admiral Kingsmill had learned a lesson. He had no ships. Is somebody with a problem? No. They had no ships for local patrols. They had the cruiser Niobe that went to sea. She was in not very good shape, and they tended to have engine room breakdowns. So Kingsmill called John Eaton back again in about March of 1915 and said, was the offer of the loan of his yacht still in effect? And John Eaton said, yes, certainly. The advantage to this ship was that she had radio. And you'll notice she had very tall masts. And the masts were because he had a radio in the ship, which was unusual in those days, in order to talk to his store if they needed him, if he was off cruising around the Great Lakes. He said, yes, it was available, and the Navy took her up. And she became HMCS Hochelaga. And there she is. The problem was all the upper deck part is wood. And she is, although she has a steel hull, she's not very new. She's about 10 years old, or no more than that, 15 years old. And they turned out in the winter of 1915, she tended to leak a lot. Also, she was being manned, of course, by reserves as much as they could, because there were hardly any permanent force. On the way down from the Great Lakes to Halifax, she rammed another ship, and there's a fair amount of damage, and that lawsuit went on for a couple of years before they settled it. And when she got to sea in the Atlantic, she tended to leak, including leaking water into a radio room, which was down here in the main part of the hull. And the radio shorted out, and she didn't prove very satisfactory.
Belongs in here.
And the ship was decommissioned in 1916 and sold. And in fact, she was sold privately, was used down in the Caribbean, and she ran into trouble down there and sank during the war. So at that stage of the game, Kingsmill realized he was going to have to do something else. And at that stage of the game, this man arrived on the scene. And that is John Kenneth Levinson Ross, JKL Ross. He was actually a lieutenant in the CMR, in the Royal Montreal Regiment, the RMR, the Black Watch in Montreal. And he had friends in the Navy from Montreal who told him that there were no ships available, and they were having to be transferred back and forth between the government ships that he could lay his hands on, like Cartier and Lady Evelyn. And then when they were needed, they all had to go to another ship if there was one available. And Jack Ross was, by this time, a millionaire. His father, who was James Ross, was a great friend of Lord Strathcona. And he was involved, in fact, in the placing, and that's him with the beard there, in the driving of the last spike in 1855 of the CPR. And James Ross provided a lot of the financing for the private railway of the CPR, which was where he made his money. So Jack Ross was comfortably off, to say the least. So he said to Admiral Kingsmill, if you'll transfer me from the Black Watch to the Navy and let me commander, I'll go down to the States and pick up a useful yacht, and we'll go from there. Well, Kingsmill thought this wasn't a bad deal. And not only that, but Ross agreed that he would pay for the yacht himself, which he did, and he would also pay for a refitting. In September 1914, he went to R.L. Borden, the prime minister, and gave him a check for $500,000, and this is in 1914 money, to use in any way that would help the war effort, with no accounting necessary. And that's the kind of money that Jack Ross was working with. So he went down to the States, and the first one he bought was the one on the right, the Tarantula, who had been owned by W.K. Vanderbilt, who was the Vanderbilt II, in fact, who was involved in the American railroad system. And this is the kind of yacht he had as a private yacht. Not much accommodation on board. About 33% of the yacht was taken up by engine room space. She was very fast, but she was taken up and brought up into the Canadian Navy as underneath there, HMCS Tuna. And Ross was given a 2-week course in navigation, and then he was appointed in command of the ship in December 1914. He commanded her on patrols around the Nova Scotia coast to Sydney, into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and up as far as Newfoundland, to considerable surprise, because they were keeping it pretty quiet. Because the deal was that the Americans, by what's called Section 17, made it an offense under law for anybody to provide anything from the States in the way of equipment that would be used by nations that were at war, like Canada was. And that wasn't acceptable. So not only would the owner be fined and go to jail, but the yacht would be seized. So they had to be very quiet about it until it was up and in business, which at that time the tuna was. So there was no cost to the Navy at all, because Ross paid for the yacht and also paid for her refitting. This worked out very well, and it seemed once they had her tried and she was along the coast on patrols watching for submarines, he offered to go down again, which he did. And he went down and he bought the Winchester, which was owned by a fellow by the name of Peter Rouse. He was a son of Broadway Rouse, who was a merchant in New York City, made a lot of money. And Rouse had the same kind, relatively the same kind of yacht. They're steam turbine yachts, and she was brought up. Only by this time, Ross was feeling the pinch a little bit, so the government agreed to pay for it, and they paid $100,000 to acquire the grills and paid for her outfitting. Each one was fitted with a gun forward, and in the case of tuna, gun aft, and Grilse was provided with a torpedo tube in the middle here as well, a single torpedo tube which was carried on deck when it was not in the tube. So this went very well. However, by the summer of 1915, they were getting enough people into the Navy that there were what they would call regular naval officers. Admittedly, some of them were reserves, and they got the crew together in order to finance the running of the Navy, and Ross was released and went to Ottawa to a government job. In fact, he was on the pension board, was his main title, but he retained his rank, and in fact, he was promoted to commander. These yachts came from this source. That's Turbinia, which the Yarrow Company was trying to convince the Royal Navy to change over from coal and oil fuel to turbine drive, and they ran this. They had during one of Queen Victoria's Jubilee celebrations, they ran this through the assembled home fleet at 40 knots. The RN were not impressed and didn't buy it, but the Americans who wanted fast yachts for civilian use, they were impressed, and those two yachts from the before were in fact models from the Turbinia and were made by the Yarrows. Those of you who are involved with horse racing at all may recognize that. That's Sir Barton, who was owned by Jack Ross, and in 1919 was the first horse ever to win the Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont Stakes and the Triple Crown. If you go down to Churchill Downs, it's the first name on the list of horses that have won the Triple Crown, but those three races was owned by Jack Ross. He trained them in the United States, and that's his trainer, H.T. Bedwell. And Jack Ross continued to wear his uniform, but was always known as Commander Ross. This picture was taken in the 1920s. Quite a character, and there's a book by his son, which makes it interesting as well. You can get it. Well, this system worked very well. The chief of the naval staff was impressed, and so were they. It seemed like a good idea. So they approached Toronto man, and that's Emilius Jarvis, who was a Toronto financier. He was involved in all sorts of things, and some of them a little shady in Toronto, but he was an ardent supporter of the government's war effort. And that's a poster from a talk he was giving down in Thorold, Ontario. He gave talks around the country, encouraging people to volunteer and give money and so on. And that's his office on Bay Street, where he ran a recruiting office for the Royal Navy. And then recruiting people could sign up there, and he would pay their shipment, their passage over to England to join the various things in the Royal Navy, which he was in favor of. And he's quite a man. So they approached Emilius Jarvis. He was also a yacht racer and had won some of the prestigious yacht races and owned a yacht himself, of course, which they requisitioned. Then he went down to the States to buy a yacht. These are the yachts he bought, or at least the bottom two are. The top one is Watauris, became HMCS Hochelaga, and another one called the Columbia became the Stadacona. And the interesting things about these two are that they're almost identical in design and layout and shape from John Eaton's Flora, only they were much better constructed. They were mostly built in North America, and they were better constructed, and there was no problem, and they served throughout the war, the first war. And in fact, Stadacona was kept for a year and a half after the war and was transferred to the Coast Guard for a while. Hochelaga was sold right after the end of the war. But that's the kind of thing that they were working with. And then the government vessels they acquired very often had to be transferred back for their use when they were needed for servicing the lighthouses and placing buoys or breaking ice in the wintertime and that kind of thing, or protecting the fisheries, whereas these were permanent naval vessels and had commissions and were served in naval forces. There's a rather nice painting by Arthur Lismer, and this in the right foreground here is HMCS Grilse. Her torpedo is here, you can see, and her after gun is here. And so on, and this is the kind of thing they did. They took the ships to sea from Halifax until they were well out into the Atlantic, and then they were on their own, or very often they'd have a British battleship or heavy cruiser that would meet them and go with them on the way. But they lost practically no troop ships, although they were by this time losing a lot of merchant ships every day. But it was a very successful way of operating as far as the Navy was concerned. The only case where there was an actual encounter with a submarine was when Hochelaga, commanded by Lieutenant Robert Leggett, came across out off Halifax in the open Atlantic. The U-156 had already started shelling a fishing schooner that was lying on her side. Her crew they'd allowed them to get off. They were in a lifeboat, and Leggett approached with Hochelaga. All he had with him was a trawler that was HMCS. They were building trawlers. They were called the TR class trawlers, but he knew Cartier was around, and she was rather heavier and better armed. And he turned around and signaled the trawler, "Have you seen Cartier?" When they heard this ashore afterwards, the submarine left and submerged and left the Hochelaga to pick up the survivors. He was court-martialed and dismissed the service for cowardice. There's been a lot of thought recently that was pretty harsh, because he had a 3-inch gun and the U-165 had 2 5-inch guns. If she'd elected to remain on the surface, there would have been no question. It might have been another Battle of Coronel, and the trawler and Hochelaga would have been sunk, obviously. But that was not apparently acceptable to the authorities, and he was dismissed. Robert Leggett was dismissed. There have been a couple of articles recently saying that was unnecessarily harsh crime, or harsh treatment. However, that was that. After the war, the vessels were sold to various, the ones that were any use at all. Of the lot, that's Grilse in the upper left. They sold to Solomon Guggenheim. You've heard of the Guggenheim Museum in New York. Post-war, apparently in the days before too much smoke was very vital. She was eventually lost in the storm on Long Island Sound in New York, while she was still owned by Solomon Guggenheim. Down below, in the picture below here, the Hochelaga was sold and became a ferry between Pictou and Prince Edward Island. Ran every day, including Sunday, between Pictou and Prince Edward Island, and went off from 8:30 in the morning and back at 6:30 at night. And I've taken that ferry because my grandmother had a cottage at Pictou, Nova Scotia, and we used to go down there when I was a boy every year. And then one year I went on the ferry over to Prince Edward Island on Hochelaga, which is an interesting touch. Hochelaga, in fact, is interesting. When the Second War started, the guy that owned her, John Fraser from Halifax, decided that running a ferry in wartime with the possibility of being sunk by a U-boat was not a good idea, so he sold her. And then her situation becomes very remarkable in that her new owners are not what they say they are in records. She was bought by an Israeli outfit that owned her for a while with the idea that they would bring any surviving Jews from Europe to Israel, they hoped. But of course, there was the problem between the Jews and the Arabs about Israel. So in 1919, she picked up some, 1946, she picked up a bunch of Israelis that had survived, or Jews that had survived the Holocaust, and loaded 500 on board Hochelaga and took them to Israel, except she was intercepted off Israel by 2 RN destroyers and towed up to Cyprus, where they had camps for them, and they stayed there until they sorted out the business of the formation of Israel, in which case they were then allowed to go to Israel as survivors. But that's the end of Hochelaga's story, because she was then scrapped in Cyprus, as far as we can tell, but there are no records at all because it was done very clandestinely. Then we have a pause of 20 years. We had the rundown of the Canadian Navy. We acquired 2 RN oil-fed cruisers, which we got dispensed with after a couple of years. We had 2 destroyers, Patriot and Patrician, and replaced by Stina and Saguenay. And then we gradually began acquiring a few more. But that was the trouble. That's what we had. We had 6 destroyers like that. That's Restigouche, and 4 wooden minesweepers made of wood and wooden minesweepers. Fine for minesweeping, but not an awful lot of good if you're facing a U-boat with a couple of 4-inch guns if you're unlucky. But however, Admiral Nellies, who was by then the chief of the naval staff, had experience during the First War, and he thought this yachting system might be not a bad idea to copy again. It worked fairly well from the First War. We had 5 of them eventually. So he said, well, all right, maybe the answer is to do that again. So he spoke to External Affairs in Ottawa, and these are the people that got involved. There's Admiral Nellies on the left representing the Navy, Dr. Hugh Keenley side of the Department of External Affairs, and his field representative, Leslie Thompson. In the fall of 1939, Nellie sent 2 of his commanders, but wearing civilian clothes and just known as Mr., of course, because of the law was still in effect. Title 19, it was known, was the law. Ruhr Roy, which was that man, and Leonard Murray, who most of you will know of, were sent down to scout around amongst yacht dealers and yacht owners in the States what was available down there. And they made a list of what they saw and came home, but they didn't buy anything. They couldn't buy anything because although they hid their fact that they were naval officers, they didn't hide it, in that if anybody knew what their name was, they could look them up on a Navy list and they'd be listed. And then there'd be real trouble, not only for the yacht owners, but also for them if they were caught trying to buy things for war purposes. So then during the winter of 1914-15, the Navy began contacting people, or at least External Affairs did. The Navy was kept out of it, which rather annoyed the Navy. In fact, Admiral Nellie said, we should have a say about the yachts. And they said, no, you don't. You don't have any say at all. The whole thing is being run by External Affairs and a bunch of civilians, not by the Navy at all, to provide. Not only were they protecting themselves, but they were protecting the sellers of the yachts as well, whether they were a yacht broker or an owner who would go to jail or be fined, and the yacht would be seized if they were found out they were being sold to the Canadian Navy. There was Tom Molson of Montreal, the Molson's Brewery, Stuart Playfair, a financier here in Toronto, who owned the yacht he's standing in there now, Ralph Bell from Halifax, Sidney Olin from the beer people in Halifax as well. Commodore Tom Wade, who was not a Commodore until after the war, but he was Commodore afterwards of the RCYC. And on the right, lower right corner, is Monty McCrae, who was a yachts owner in the Port Credit Yacht Club. And they were people that were sent to the States to buy some more yachts. And in fact, just to record, these are also the ones that were sent down. Turnbull with the Bridge Company in Montreal, Clarence Wallace, who later became Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. Irvin Keenlyside was a brother of David Keenlyside, George Duggan, Philip Ross, and Pearson McCurdy. Philip Ross is no relation to the previous one. But they were all sent down to look for something in the way of yachts. Now, this is the kind of thing they look for. Now, the Memory 3 from Bay City, Michigan was a lovely yacht, obviously would be perfectly useful. And of course, the Americans weren't at war at this stage of the game in the winter of 1914-15. So there was no objection to a yachtsman coming down and buying a replacement yacht if necessary. And then the one on the right is the Aztec in Boston, Mass. She was, in fact, Tom Molson went down and had a look at her. He said she was fine. She was in good shape, except she was sitting on the bottom in 6 feet of water. She had sunk alongside the jetty in Boston. But he had a look through her and decided she was quite fine. He had the valve that had let go replaced. She had it repaired. This is where she's sitting in her dock, in the dry dock in Boston, being repaired. And then he steamed her up to Halifax, and that's what he did. This is how the system works. This is Frederick Jones, who was a Halifax businessman and is the father of Peter Jones, that some of you may know from HMCS York. He was approached by Wesley Thompson, who said, well, Mr. Jones, we're requisitioning your yacht, the Wanderway. I think that's Wanderway, although Peter may dispute it, but that's what I was told was Wanderway, but I couldn't get any guarantee that it was. And he said, that's fine. I'm in the artillery. He was in the Halifax artillery. He said, I'll be going off to war anyway, presumably at some time. And this would be in the probably around Christmas time of 1914-15. And go ahead, and that's all right. And Leslie Thompson said, now, Mr. Jones, we wouldn't mind if you wanted to go down to the States and buy a replacement yacht. Well, Mr. Jones said, I'm not going to buy a replacement yacht. I'm going to be off with the Army. It's wartime. Why in the world would I want to do that? He said, Mr. Jones, we would like you to go down and buy a replacement. Well, Mr. Jones wasn't a dummy. And he said, oh, I see what's going on. All right, yes, I'll do that. How much is it going to be, and how do you pay for it? And he said, it'll probably be about $130,000 for a useful yacht, and you'll get a loan from the bank. He said, my bank isn't going to loan me $130,000 with a war on to buy a replacement yacht. Mr. Jones, just go and ask your bank. So he went down to the Bank of Nova Scotia and said, well, the Navy have requisitioned my yacht. I think I'll go and buy a replacement for it. Nothing's much happening. And the bank said, Mr. Jones, that'll be just fine. That's quite all right. You just go ahead and do that. So Mr. Jones went down, and in fact, he went down to Boston first. He didn't like what he saw there, so he went down to Mississippi, and he saw the Avalon. And this was the Avalon, which was obviously a perfectly good yacht. She'd been built in 1932 in the States in Boston, and she became HMCS Bison, which I served in the war, the one on the right, the lower right corner. So that's the way it worked. Now, what they got was this gang. Here are a bunch of them. The Beaver on the upper left was probably the largest of the lots that served. She was the Aztec that you saw in the other picture. She only lasted to about 1944. By that time, she was worn out, and they're having more and more trouble repairing her. But she was also used as a test vessel for Canadian radars, which were not very satisfactory. The Canadian-style radar was about 2 years behind what the RN was managing to get, and even Debbie Pears got a loan of one, but they didn't have time to fit it when he was on one of his convoy escorts to the UK, so they gave him the set, but when he got to Halifax, they wouldn't install it because they insisted that Canadian ships had to have all Canadian radars, which annoyed Debbie considerably. The two on the right, Caribou and Reindeer, were workhorses. They were standard patrol. They did anti-submarine. They were all fitted with Aztec. They were Aztec. If you look at Raccoon there at the top, that's the Aztec hut on top of the bridge. The bridge is there. The Aztec hut is on top of the bridge. And the same with Beaver. That's the Aztec hut on top of the bridge. So if you're hunting a submarine, that's where the Aztec was kept. They had a gun forward and they had depth charges aft. And you can see in Caribou, the two openings here on her stern for the depth charge rails, because by the time we were going to war, the depth charges were perfectly satisfactory, and they were exactly the same as used by the corvettes and frigates and so on for the rest of the war. The Renard also was one because she had served as a patrol vessel in the American Navy in the First War. She was also ran out of usable steam by beginning of 1944, so she was laid up alongside of for that. The Grizzly had German engines in her, which they hadn't realized at the time. Clarence Wallace hadn't realized that was very vital, because the Navy hadn't told them anything, because they weren't allowed to tell them anything. And her engines gave out very quickly, so she became a stationary guard ship at Powell River, off the mouth of the Powell River harbor, to question any vessels appearing. And then Raccoon up above here was the only vessel to be torpedoed by a U-boat during the war. I'll say a few more words about that later on. Here's another bunch. Again, Moose and Wolf and Bison were all just workhorses. They were patrol ships. The Wolf on the west coast, and the other ones were mostly working out of Halifax and Sydney or in the St. Lawrence River. And Lynx also was one that didn't work out very well, in that her engines tended to break down and she tended to leak rather badly. So she gave up, but they gave up with her by about 1943 or 44, and they weren't able to use her any longer. The Otter, the one in the upper right, there is no wartime picture of her, because she caught fire off the Sambro light vessel off Halifax, and they lost a whole bunch of people from that. I'll tell you a little bit more about it as we go on, but she sank in early 1942. The other bunch, Husky was one of the really successful ones. She was an excellent patrol ship, and she lasted until 2005, in fact, in her post-war life. And there'll be a bit more about her. In fact, she was used it was sold to the city of New Orleans for their city tour ship for people. They were guests, or they were showing somebody around, convincing them to use New Orleans as a harbor or whatever. And she was used as a tour ship, and for that. And then she was used as a diving tender for a while in the Honduras, in the Caribbean. And then she was used as a restaurant in New Orleans. And I've been and had supper on her in about 1990, when we used to spend some winters down in Florida after I retired. And she had ran a very nice restaurant, rebuilt. So he lasted very well. The other two are standard Cougar and Elk, are standard patrol ships, worked very well, did an excellent job. They made first class ships. They each had a gun. You can see the gun there, and they'd have depth charges aft, and all had Aztec, so they worked reasonably well along the coast. There were only two ships in the Second War that were not Canadian acquisitions from the United States. These two. The first was the large Sans-Peur, who didn't have an animal name like the others, like Wolf and Elk and so on, because it wasn't necessary, because he left her in Esquimalt. When the war started in September 1939, he left for home right away. He had a wartime job of some kind, and he told the RN they could have his ship, but she was on the west coast of Canada at Esquimalt. So the RN told the Canadian Navy they could have her. She'd be on loan to the Canadian Navy, so we commissioned her as HMCS Sans-Peur. She was a lovely ship, a diesel engine, quite fast, do about 25 knots. And in 1943, the Canadian Navy bought her from the RN for, I thought, a rather ungrateful amount, considering that we'd saved their bacon to quite an extent, of $305,000 in 1943 money, which seems rather a lot. She was kept for a couple of years after the war and used for various duties for shepherding people around, and then became a show ship for people doing business shows. The only Canadian one at all was one owned by Charlie Shepherd, and was this one, HMCS Ambler, and she was, he had owned her because he was in the forestry business in Georgian Bay, and he used her for traveling around Georgian Bay. He was a competitor of Stuart Playfair, who owned quite a large yacht, as you saw him standing in that one before. And Charlie Shepherd didn't like to be overwhelmed by Stuart Playfair, so he acquired the Ambler, but it was rather too large for Penetanguishene and Thorold, at least, and Thornbury and so on. And he tended to be hard on jetties and that kind of thing. And I think he was rather glad to get rid of her because he sold her for $1 to the Canadian Navy, and she was used for patrol. She couldn't have a gun because she had these bulkheads around her forecastle to keep her reasonably dry. So she couldn't be fitted with a gun, although she was fitted with depth charges. But she was useful as a patrol ship for exactly the same thing. She has Aztec up here and so on, and everything worked reasonably well as a standard patrol ship. Their main battle experience was defending convoys running between Montreal and Quebec and Sydney, Nova Scotia, or Corner Brook, Newfoundland. And this in 1942 were the ships that were sunk in the St. Lawrence River in the Battle of the St. Lawrence, including 2 warships, the Charlottetown corvette there and the Raccoon there. Raccoon was shepherding a convoy from Quebec to Sydney on the 3rd of September 1942 at night. She was on the north side of the convoy, and there were 2 fair miles on a corvette out in front of the convoy and 2 fair miles on either side. They heard a bang in the middle of the night, and they thought it was Raccoon dropping depth charges on something. They heard nothing. She was hit by 2 torpedoes, which of course demolished her instantly, killing everybody. The only body that was found was the body of Russ McConnell, which was washed up on the shore here, of Anticosti Island, a few days later. That's all they ever found of her, except 1 life ring and a couple of pieces of wood. And the Charlottetown, they found bits and pieces. But these were all merchant ships that were torpedoed during the war in 1942. And Germans tried again in 1943, but we were more prepared. Hunting in the St. Lawrence was very difficult because there were layers. There were fresh water coming downstream and salt water, tidal water coming upstream almost as far as Quebec City. The submarine could drop below that layer, and she was absolutely undetectable by Aztec, and no German submarines were sunk by any ship in the fresh water, salt water exchange system. The submarine could drop below the hydrocline and not be found at all. It was a tough law, but on the other hand, they were being very careful, and there was very good air patrol over that period of time. The war losses were the 2 Otter, lost by fire off Halifax, with a loss of 2 officers and 17 crew. Eventually, they saved a dozen in the small boat, which had capsized alongside a freighter while they were trying to rescue her. It was really quite a tragedy. One of the people in the boat, there were 3 people in the boat, and they had to set the boat back to try and rescue the captain, who was still on board Otter. She was blazing on fire. All the woodwork was on fire. And the captain, Mossman, was still, they saw was on board. So the boat put back. 3 men in the boat volunteered to leap overboard and hold on to the Carly float. And one of them died. He received a mention in dispatches, which seems rather churlish. But in fact, if it's not in the face of the enemy, the only decorations that are possibly available would be the Victoria Cross, or mentioned in dispatches. And Ian Walter O'Hara is a name that we should know, because he gave up his place in the boat, which was reasonably safe, although quite a few of them were lost when it was upset trying to get alongside. And the picture of a raccoon there on the left, which was completely demolished by 2 torpedoes, as you might guess, on a boat that size. After the war, the boats were sent off for various things. Probably one of the more successful ones in the lower left is the steamer Grand Manan, formerly HMCS Elk. She was the ferry between St. John, New Brunswick, and Grand Manan Island in the Bay of Fundy, and lasted until 1965. On the upper left was the Gulf Stream, turned into a ferry. She was lost in 1947 on an island off the Powell River. Her captain and her master, or the captain and her mate, were both lost their license for having been drinking before they sailed and not supervising the helmsman. She ran on a rock, capsized. She's still there. They've rescued her 2 bronze propellers, but that's all. The only one of the lot of them that became an ex-yacht again was this one, and the Fraternity, the Wolf, and she became a private yacht for Joseph Simard, of the shipbuilder in Quebec City, and she was used for several years and then sold to another owner in the Mediterranean as a private yacht. The Saint-Père was in such good shape. She was kept for 2 years and then was turned into a display ship for commercial use in Gibraltar, and then sent to Japan, or Japanese writing here, for taking people around. They fill her full of fancy electronic equipment and take people to sea for a nice trip for a day or a few days and sell them on their produce. And she was used for that. And that was the way she lasted. The total cost of the yachts in the Second War ran to just under $2 million, $1,966,000, plus $769,000 for their modification, which is really, but it worked out on an average of $123,000 a yacht. That's not bad for the saving of the yachts. As for saving them, you can't build for $123,000. You can't build a patrol ship, and which they were. They were gradually replaced by Bangor minesweepers and by various patrol ships. They built the Fairmiles and away took their place after the First War. There were 7 shipyards that converted them. And if you think that this was all just for we people who served in them, this was all sweetness and life and serving in a lovely yacht. First of all, they were crowded because they were, as yachts, had crews of maybe 12 or 14 at the most. We had a working crew probably of 25, so it tended to be rather crowded, to say the least. It wasn't always nice. There's a picture of Bison, the ex-yacht Avalon, taken trying to get out of Digby. Digby got into Annapolis Bay, from Annapolis Station into the Bay of Fundy in February 1944. That's the kind of thing you ran into. It wasn't all sweetness and light. We were but warriors for the working day. Our gayness and our guilt were all besmirched with rainy marching in the painful field. But in the main, our hearts were in the trim. I always end with that picture. I think it's one of the best wartime pictures going. That's Lahalois. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of my talk. Is there any questions?
Well, I must say that it was an absolutely fascinating presentation. And I mean, I didn't know half, well, I didn't know any of what was, what happened at that particular time. And I appreciate you, you're coming out and doing it. And we do have a gift for you. I can't give it to you personally, but Susan will take care of that for you. And I would like to thank the behind-the-scenes team at RCMI for their support. And a special thank you to Margit and Thanuja, who are our hosts this evening. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I now declare this meeting ended. Thank you for attending, and I'm sure if you email myself or RCMI any questions, they can be passed on to Fraser. So thank you very much, and good night all.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.